The wind sliced through the busy streets, causing people to shrug their shoulders as they hurried along. William, a 50-year-old man, stood at the corner he had frequented for years. He wore a worn-out coat, and his calloused hands held the remaining newspapers he had left to sell. The hurried glances of passers-by barely noticed him, as if he were a permanent part of the urban landscape, an invisible face in the daily rush. William adjusted his tattered hat and looked up at the grey sky, trying to ignore the back pain that had been with him since early morning. He knew he needed to sell the last few newspapers to have something to eat that night. So far, he had only managed to make $5. It was little, but he was used to counting on the bare minimum. Then he saw him, a boy, skinny and dirty, with torn clothes, walking along the sidewalk begging for alms. The boy had large eyes, filled with silent despair, approaching people with an outstretched hand, only to be ignored. William watched for a few minutes, and something inside him tightened. He knew what it was like to feel hungry, knew what it was like to have nothing. The boy stopped near William, hesitating. He was so discouraged that he seemed to lack the strength even to ask for help. William looked at the $5 he was holding. It was all he had made that day, and he needed that money to secure dinner. But looking at the boy, he realized the boy needed it more. "Hey, kid," William called out, his voice hoarse and tired. The boy looked at him, scared, as if he expected to be pushed away or ignored again. William took a step toward him and extended his hand with the $5. "Take this. Buy something to eat," he said softly, a gentleness he rarely used. The boy hesitated, looking at the money and then at William, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "But, sir, you don't need this," the boy asked, his voice trembling. William forced a smile, despite the tightness in his chest. "I'll manage," he replied, trying to appear confident. "But you need it now." The boy took the money with trembling hands, his eyes welling with gratitude. He said nothing more, just nodded slowly and, after a moment, turned to leave. William watched him walk away, feeling a mix of relief and concern. He knew he would have to make up for the lost money, but at that moment he didn't think much about it. As the cold wind whistled around him, he tightened his coat around his body and went back to selling his newspapers, trying to focus on the passing customers. But the look of the hungry boy stayed with him, even as the boy disappeared into the crowd. Later, when day finally gave way to night, William gathered the remaining newspapers and returned to his small apartment. His legs were heavy, and the cold seemed to penetrate his bones. He climbed the creaky steps of the old, dimly lit building he called home. Upon entering the tiny apartment, William let out a deep sigh, took off his coat, and sank into a chair. The silence of the place was deafening. He quickly thought about the money he had given the boy, but didn't regret it. He knew that somehow he would survive, as he always had. He was used to making do with what little he had. As he prepared to sleep, his thoughts were no longer on the boy. They were on the bills he needed to pay, the food missing from the pantry, and the effort he would have to make the next day. After all, for William, life had always been a daily battle, and tomorrow would be just another round. The door to William's apartment closed with a heavy creak, carrying the same fatigue he felt in his bones. He sighed deeply, letting the weight of the day slip from his tired shoulders. The silence that enveloped him upon entering was familiar, and yet relentless. That small space, with peeling walls and old furniture, was the only place he could call home, but sometimes it felt more like a prison. He hung his coat on the rusty hook by the door and went straight to the kitchen. The space was cramped, with a time-worn wooden table and a stove that creaked with every touch. He opened the cabinet and grabbed a can of cheap soup. "It'll have to do," he muttered to himself, while opening the can with the old can opener, his movements mechanical, so accustomed to this routine. As the soup heated on the stove, William sat at the table, staring at the yellowed wall in front of him. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his unkempt beard. The sound of the soup bubbling on the stove echoed in the empty apartment. He briefly thought of the boy to whom he had given the $5 days ago, but the memory already seemed distant, diluted by the weight of his own struggles. "I can't afford to think about that right now," he whispered, trying to push the image of the boy out of his mind. His problems were here, and they were immense. The rent was overdue, the food was scarce, and the back pain, always present, was getting worse each day. In the following days, the routine repeated as always. William woke up early, went out to sell newspapers, and returned late at night to the same oppressive silence of his apartment. He never complained. There was no one to hear his grievances anyway. He had no children, no wife, no friends to confide in. He had long accepted that loneliness was his most faithful companion. Years went by, but lately, things were different. He was beginning to feel the signs of aging more intensely. His cough, which was initially just a nuisance, had become constant, a subtle warning that something was wrong. He coughed so much that sometimes he could barely breathe. "It's just tiredness. It'll pass," he told himself repeatedly, trying to ignore the growing fear in his chest. He couldn't afford the cost of a doctor, so he convinced himself that the problem wasn't that serious. He tried to keep busy with work, but each day seemed a little harder than the last. One late afternoon, after another frustrating day of sales, William returned home more exhausted than usual. He could barely drag himself to the chair in the kitchen. As he rubbed his temples with the tips of his fingers, trying to ease the throbbing headache, he heard a light knock on the door. It was Mrs. Jenkins, his neighbor from downstairs, a kind-hearted 70-year-old lady who, despite her own problems, always made a point to check on how William was doing. "Hi, William," she said, her voice low and tired. "I was making some soup. I thought you might want some." He looked at her with a forced smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. But I'm fine. I have something to eat here." She watched him for a moment, her expression full of concern. "You look way too tired. I'm not trying to intrude, but maybe you should rest more. Or see a doctor." William shook his head, trying to appear unconcerned. "I'm really okay. Just tired. I'll get through this." She nodded, but her expression showed she wasn't convinced. "If you need anything at all, let me know, all right?" He smiled, grateful. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. You're always so kind." After she left, William sat in silence, her offer still echoing in his mind. He knew he needed help, but his pride always kept him from accepting it. No matter how much his health was deteriorating, he still believed he could face everything alone, as he always had. However, that night, while lying in bed, the cough returned forcefully, preventing him from falling asleep. He curled up under the blankets, trying to find a comfortable position, but the back pain wouldn't let him rest. Fear began to infiltrate his thoughts, a feeling he had always tried to avoid. And so, the shadow of illness approached, silent, insistent, threatening to take away the little that remained of William. But even in the face of this reality, he continued to face his days with the same dignity he always had, believing that, somehow, he would survive once more, as he always did. In the days that followed, William continued to push his body beyond its limits, selling newspapers on the streets as he always had. But the reality of his worsening health could no longer be ignored. The cough that was once sporadic now accompanied him constantly, intensifying to the point of leaving him breathless. The back pain, which he had attributed to age, became unbearable. Even so, William persisted, determined not to give up. He needed money. He still had bills to pay, food to buy. The idea of stopping didn't seem like an option. One afternoon, while trying to sell the last copies of the day, exhaustion overtook his body unexpectedly. He leaned against a nearby wall, feeling his vision darken. The crowd continued to flow around him, oblivious to his presence. William tried to catch his breath, but the cough came violently, bringing with it a sharp pain in his chest. He staggered, and before he could steady himself, he fell to his knees on the sidewalk. The city seemed to spin around him. "William!" The familiar voice of John, a neighbor who often passed by, cut through the street noise. John rushed to him, holding him before he could fall completely to the ground. "Hey, are you okay? Come on, I'll help you." William tried to protest, but the words came out weak. "I'm fine. Just need to rest." Rest? John looked at him incredulously. "You're more than tired, William. This is too far. You need a doctor." With great effort, and practically leaning on John's arms, William was taken back to his apartment. Every step up the stairs felt like climbing a mountain. When they finally reached the 4th floor, he could barely stand. John helped him lie down on the bed. "You have to stop this," John said seriously, covering him with a blanket. "This isn't just tiredness, William. If you keep this up, you'll end up." "I know," William interrupted, his voice faltering. "I know I need help, but I don't have money for doctors." John sighed, frustrated. "You can't keep going like this. I'll see what I can do. Maybe find someone to help you get to a doctor for free." William closed his eyes, feeling his entire body ache. He wanted to believe everything would be okay, that it was just a bad phase. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. In the days that followed, William remained confined to his apartment. He was too weak to go out and sell newspapers, and every time he tried to get up, the cough knocked him back down. The neighbors, including John, began visiting him more often, bringing food and asking how he was doing. William, however, avoided asking for help directly. His pride was one of the few things he still had left. His financial situation began to tighten more than ever. The rent was overdue, and the small help from the neighbors, as generous as it was, wasn't enough to cover basic needs. William started to realize that his life was falling apart in a way he had never imagined. As he lay in bed at night, listening to the distant sounds of city traffic, he thought about what the future held. Every cough brought a new wave of pain, and each passing day made him feel more and more powerless. But still, a part of William clung to the hope that, somehow, he would survive this battle. However, the shadow of illness was already advancing, silent and relentless, and William knew he was running out of time. William's apartment was dark and silent when, once again, he was awakened by a violent cough. It was early morning, and he felt like he could barely breathe. Exhaustion was taking over his body relentlessly. He knew he couldn't continue like this, but he still refused to ask for help. He had always been a proud man, someone who had grown used to facing life alone. However, his neighbor John, worried about William's health, took the initiative to seek help. Without informing William, he contacted the city's social services, reporting the desperate situation his friend was in. The next day, a gentle knock on William's door pulled him from a light nap. He took a long time to get out of bed, his breathing heavy and his body aching with every movement. When he opened the door, he was met by a young woman with a kind expression, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a folder in her hands. "Mr. William," the woman asked with a calm smile. "My name is Emily. I'm a social worker. I was informed about your situation and came to see how I can help." William, still somewhat groggy, narrowed his eyes. "I didn't ask for help," he replied, his voice hoarse and firm, trying to maintain his dignity despite the obvious weakness. "I know," Emily said, with a compassionate tone. "But it seems your neighbor, John, is quite concerned about you." William shook his head, sighing, and took a step back, allowing her to enter. He knew resisting wouldn't solve anything. The room was cluttered, with a few empty food cans and a pile of old newspapers stacked in a corner. Emily looked around, assessing the situation. "So," she began after a few seconds of silence, "you're dealing with an illness, right? It seems you need medical care." William sat heavily in a chair, leaning on the table. "I can't afford doctors. I'm already behind on rent, and I can barely buy food." Emily sat across from him, maintaining a gentle and welcoming gaze. "I understand, but there are assistance programs that can help people in your situation. That's why I'm here, to make sure you receive what you need. Maybe we can find some form of treatment, or at least relief for your condition." William shook his head slowly, still reluctant. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone. I've always managed on my own, and I'm not going to start depending on others now." Emily looked at him for a moment before speaking with a tenderness in her voice that seemed to pierce William's defenses. "You know, accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is allow people to care about us." William remained silent. It struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He had always been so focused on surviving on his own that he had forgotten there was kindness and compassion in the world, even when everything seemed lost. Finally, he nodded, accepting reality. "All right," he said, his voice sounding tired but less resistant. "What do you suggest?" Emily smiled slightly, pulling a notepad from her bag. "Let's start by finding a solution for your health. I know you mentioned you couldn't afford a doctor, but I can try to see if there's a community clinic that can take your case. Also, you mentioned you're behind on rent. Is there any family that could help?" William laughed without humor. "Family? I haven't talked to anyone in years. I had a cousin, but I haven't seen him in decades. I don't think he even remembers I exist." Emily wrote down the cousin's name, even though it was a vague clue. "It's worth a try. I'll reach out to your cousin and see if I can get something. In the meantime, we'll work to ensure you have access to some kind of treatment." William sighed and closed his eyes for a moment. He knew time was running out, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt he wasn't entirely alone in this struggle. Emily stood up, preparing to leave. Before she left, she placed a light hand on William's shoulder. "I'll be back in a few days, Mr. William. We'll figure this out. In the meantime, please try to rest." He nodded, watching her walk out the door. When she was gone, the apartment returned to its usual silence, but now there was something different. A slight hope, a fragile flame, began to kindle within him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Days passed slowly, as if time were dragging along with William's tired body. Emily had promised to return, and true to her word, she reappeared a few days later with news. She had managed to locate William's distant cousin, a man named Robert, who lived in a nearby city. He was willing to come visit him, although reluctance was evident in his voice over the phone, as Emily had mentioned. When Robert finally arrived, William felt a mix of emotions he couldn't clearly define. He was sitting in his old chair, awaiting what would be an uncomfortable reunion. He hadn't seen Robert in over 20 years, and the last memory he had of him was vague, a family gathering when they were both still young. Since then, their lives had taken completely different paths. The door was slowly opened by Emily, who was accompanying Robert. He entered the small apartment, looking around with an expression that mixed discomfort and impatience. Robert was younger than William, perhaps in his 40s, well-dressed, and with a distant look in his eyes. "William," Robert began, without much enthusiasm. "It's been a long time." "Yes, it has," William replied, his voice a bit hoarse. "Thank you for coming." The two stared at each other for a moment, the silence filling the space between them. Robert scratched the back of his neck, clearly unsure of what to say next. He looked at Emily, as if expecting her to take control of the conversation. Emily, sensing the tension, stepped closer and spoke softly. "Robert, William is going through a tough time. He needs support, both emotional and financial. We're trying to ensure he receives the necessary medical care, but any family help would make a huge difference right now." Robert sighed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Look, don't get me wrong, but I don't even really remember William. I mean, we grew up apart, and I have my own life. I have my family, my responsibilities. I can't just take that on." William, although he had expected this response, felt a tightness in his chest. He maintained a serene expression, but inside, Robert's words hit him deeply. "I understand, Robert," William said, without bitterness in his voice. "I don't want you to feel like you need to do something for me. Just the fact that you came means something." Robert, however, seemed more relieved than moved. He took a step back, looking at Emily with an expression of someone who wants to end the matter as quickly as possible. "I'm really sorry about all this, but my life is too busy. I can't help with that." Emily tried to argue, but it was clear that Robert had already made his decision. "Of course," she said, resigned, "but know that any help, whether financial or just a bit of support, can be crucial." Robert nodded vaguely, but what he really wanted was to leave as soon as possible. "Well, I need to go." "Sorry, William," he said quickly and evasively. William simply nodded, as if he had already expected that response. "Take care, Robert. I hope your life is going well." "Thank you," Robert replied, already heading for the door. He cast one last quick look at William before leaving without saying anything more. When the door closed, silence returned to the apartment. William felt the familiar sensation of isolation settle once again in his chest. Emily stayed by his side, feeling the unspoken pain of William. "I'm sorry, William," she said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. William shook his head, forcing a small smile. "No need to apologize, Emily. I was already expecting something like this." He looked around the small space he called home and sighed. "I think I'm more alone than I thought." Emily gently squeezed his shoulder. "You're not alone, William. We're still here. I'll keep looking for alternatives for your situation. I won't give up on you." William nodded, but the fatigue was visible in his eyes. He was grateful for Emily's support, but Robert's visit had reaffirmed something he had known for a long time. He was, in fact, alone. The only thing left for him now was to accept whatever came his way, without great expectations. Emily stood up to leave, promising to return with more news as soon as she had something concrete. William silently thanked her, and as soon as she closed the door, he plunged back into silence. It was becoming harder to find the strength to continue. William's condition worsened each day. Even with the help of neighbors and Emily's constant visits, the weight of his illness became harder to bear. His back pain, now more severe, barely allowed him to get out of bed, and his cough suffocated him, bringing forth a desperate weakness. William knew he was at his limit, but he continued to resist, his mind still clinging to the idea that he could endure alone. Until, one afternoon, while Emily was on one of her routine visits, William fainted again. This time, the fall was brutal. He couldn't hold himself and hit the wooden floor hard. Emily, terrified, rushed to him, trying to revive him. Realizing he wasn't waking up, She immediately called John, the closest neighbor, who arrived quickly and helped to take William to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, after hours of agonizing wait, William was finally seen by a doctor who examined him thoroughly. The doctor's serious and concerned look did not bode well. "Mr. William," the doctor said after the examinations, "your situation is critical. Your lungs are compromised, and there's an accumulation of fluid that needs urgent treatment. Additionally, there are signs that surgery is necessary to correct the damage before it worsens irreversibly." William, still weak and dejected, looked at the doctor with eyes that reflected fatigue but also a somber resignation. "And what happens if I don't have this surgery?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor sighed, his words heavy. "Without the surgery, your condition will only deteriorate. Your chances of survival are minimal if we don't do something immediately." William closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the news crush him. He knew he didn't have the money to pay for a private surgery. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like an inevitable sentence. "How much does this surgery cost?" he asked in an almost inaudible voice. The doctor looked at Emily, who was beside William's bed, waiting for some hope. "Unfortunately," he began, "this type of surgery isn't covered by public programs. We're talking about an expensive procedure that needs to be done at a private clinic. Without resources, it will be very difficult to secure." Emily immediately intervened. "We'll find a way, William. We won't give up. There are other options. We can run campaigns, mobilize the community. We won't leave it like this." William remained silent, processing what he had just heard. He knew that the help from neighbors and Emily had been generous so far, but this was far beyond what they could achieve. Even so, a small spark of hope remained ignited by Emily's words. He knew that, alone, he no longer had the strength, but he also knew that, for the first time in a long while, there were people willing to fight for him. Determined, Emily began making plans at the hospital. She went out making calls, talking to the doctor, trying to find ways to raise money for the surgery. John, who was waiting in the corridor, also joined her, offering to help in any way needed. William, lying in the hospital bed with his head resting on the pillow, looked out the window. Night was falling, and the city lights were starting to shine. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt, even if only fragilely, that there was still a chance. He was no longer alone. It was a rainy and cold morning in New York, and William's apartment seemed even darker under the grey sky. The sound of rain hitting the window was almost comforting, but it also brought a sense of melancholy that mirrored William's state of mind. He was lying in bed, his body weak and his breathing heavy. For days, he could barely get up, and the feeling of despair was beginning to take hold. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the apartment. William frowned, surprised. He wasn't expecting visitors. With great effort, he dragged himself out of bed and slowly walked to the door. When he opened it, he was met by a woman he had never seen before. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile. "My name is Margaret. I'm your new neighbor. I just moved into the building, and some neighbors told me about your situation. I hope you don't mind the visit." William looked at her with distrust. He had been helped by neighbors before, but always briefly. People would bring small aids, but soon returned to their lives. He feared clinging to the idea that someone could be willing to stay. The thought of being abandoned again terrified him. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice hoarse and weak. "I don't want to bother anyone." Margaret smiled but didn't back down. "I'm not here to intrude, William. I just want to help. I know you've been sick, and, well, I'm a retired nurse. Maybe I can be of assistance." William hesitated, looking at the woman before him. She seemed so sincere, but he had been disappointed before. Still, something about her presence made him relent. He moved away from the door and allowed Margaret to enter. "Come in then," he said, tired. "But I don't need much. I'm just trying to manage." Margaret entered the small apartment, observing the mess around. The place was clearly neglected, with dust accumulating on the furniture and dishes piled up in the sink. The air was stuffy, and she could feel the lack of energy in the space. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Margaret asked softly, looking around. William shrugged, sitting down with difficulty in the chair next to the table. "I do what I can, but it's not easy." Margaret approached him, watching him with a clinical gaze. "You look very tired, William. I won't insist, but I think you need help more than you realize." He looked at her with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I can't ask that of you. You didn't ask." "I offered," she replied, with a firm but gentle tone. "And besides, I want to help. I've been through a lot in life. Now that I'm retired, I see this as a chance to give back." William remained silent for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. It was hard for him to understand why someone who barely knew him would be willing to do so much. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice laden with doubt. "Why do you want to do this?" Margaret smiled again, but this time there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Because, William, we all need help at some point. I believe we should offer what we can, whenever possible. And you need someone by your side now." He took a deep breath and looked at his own hands, his emotions oscillating between gratitude and the fear of disappointing again. "All right," he finally said. "But I'm not an easy burden." Margaret laughed softly. "Don't worry about that. Now, let me see what I can do for you." With that, Margaret took control of the situation. She began cleaning the apartment, organizing William's medications, and taking care of his hygiene. She was practical and efficient, moving through the small space with the confidence of someone who had years of experience in the medical field. When William insisted that she was doing too much, Margaret just laughed. "You're in control, William," she said. "I'm just here to make sure you can keep fighting." In the days that followed, William began to feel a slight improvement. His breathing, though still difficult, became less painful, and Margaret's constant presence by his side brought him a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. She was there day after day, ensuring that he wasn't left alone with his illness and his thoughts. One of those days, while Margaret was helping him sit in the chair to eat some soup, William looked at her and said, in a soft voice, "You're a light in this place, Margaret. I don't know what I would have done without you." She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all need light sometimes, William, and if I can be that light for you, then I'm doing what I should." Despite the improvement, William knew that the battle for his health was far from over. He still needed the surgery, and Margaret, as incredible as she was, couldn't cover all aspects of his medical needs. But for now, she was a breath of life in a seemingly hopeless scenario. And, for the first time in a long while, William allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. Days in Margaret's company brought William a relief he hadn't felt in a long time. His body, though still fragile and marked by pain, responded to his new friend's careful attention. The apartment, which once seemed like a dark cave, was now more organized and welcoming. Margaret kept the environment lively with her gentle energy and conversations about simple, but comforting things. However, both knew that this improvement was temporary. The need for surgery still loomed like a shadow over them. One rainy afternoon, the familiar sound of knocking on the door interrupted the apartment's calm. William looked at Margaret, who was in the kitchen preparing some soup. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, his voice still marked by hoarseness. "No, but it might be Emily," Margaret replied, drying her hands with a dish towel. She opened the door, revealing Emily, the social worker, who entered with an expression that mixed concern and determination. "William, Margaret," Emily began, removing her wet coat. "I came to see how you're doing, William." William, sitting in his usual chair near the window, gave a tired smile. "Well, as you might expect," he replied, his voice deep. "Margaret has been taking good care of me. But I don't know how much longer I have without that damn surgery." Emily nodded and sat beside him, with a deep look of concern. "I know. And that's why we need to act. I was thinking. We've tried several alternatives, but maybe it's time for a more direct approach." "Direct?" William frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Emily took a deep breath. "I'm going to write a personal letter to the city's main charitable hospital. It's a shot in the dark, I know, but I'll tell your story. I'll explain your situation, your hard work all these years, how you've always been independent and never asked for help until now. I'll beg for an exception so they can cover your surgery. I know it sounds desperate, but I believe that if someone hears your story, we might have a chance." Margaret, who had been silent until then, smiled. "I think it's an excellent idea. William, you have a life story that can touch anyone's heart. I think it's worth trying." William looked from one to the other, his heart heavy with a mix of hope and doubt. You really think this can work?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not anyone special. I just did what I could to survive." Emily smiled gently. "William, sometimes, being someone who did the best they could is more than enough. That's what I'll try to show in the letter." He remained silent for a few moments, absorbing her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right. If you think it can work, I trust you. What do I have to lose?" Margaret approached and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Nothing is lost as long as there are people fighting for you, William." In the following days, Emily and Margaret worked together on the letter. They discussed details about William's life, his humble and lonely routine as a newspaper seller, and how he had always avoided asking for help until his health reached a critical point. Every word was carefully chosen, aiming to touch the heart of whoever read the letter. Emily used all her skill and sensitivity to tell William's story truthfully, but also in a way that could resonate with the hospital doctors. Finally, the letter was sent. Now, all they could do was wait. The days that followed were slow and filled with uncertainty. William spent many sleepless nights reflecting on his life. He saw himself back in his youth, full of dreams and vigor. He remembered the choices he had made and how, somehow, everything he wanted had drifted away over time. Now, he found himself on the brink of hopelessness, sustained only by the kindness of strangers who, in some way, believed in his worth more than he did himself. One night, while William was lost in thought, Margaret sat beside him, watching him in silence before speaking. "You know, William, we all face moments when we feel alone. I've been through that too. And it's funny how sometimes, it's the people we least expect who bring light back into our lives." William looked at her, his eyes welling up. "You brought that light, Margaret. I just hope this letter makes a difference. I don't know if I can keep going like this for much longer." "It will make a difference," Margaret replied with conviction. "You have more strength than you think, William, and no matter what happens, you're no longer alone." Days later, the response finally arrived. A letter was delivered to William's apartment, stamped with the hospital seal on the envelope. His hands trembled as he held the paper. Margaret and Emily were beside him, supporting him as he opened the envelope with slow and careful movements. As he read the first words, William felt the world around him start to spin. The hospital was willing to hear his story and offer a chance for treatment. Relief and gratitude overwhelmed him with such a great force that he couldn't hold back the tears. I don't even know what to say," William whispered, his voice broken by emotion. "I didn't think something like this was possible." Margaret squeezed his hand, smiling with tear-filled eyes. "You deserve this, William, and we're going to win this battle together." The soft morning light streamed through the hospital room windows when William finally woke up. The sensation was strange, almost surreal. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. He blinked a few times, trying to focus his sight and realize where he was. The pain was still there, scattered throughout his body in small spots, but it was no longer the suffocating agony he had felt in recent months. Something had changed, and this time for the better. "William?" Margaret's voice was the first to reach him, gentle and full of concern. Turning his head with effort, he saw her there, sitting beside the bed, her eyes filled with relief and hope. Emily was next to her, wearing a warm smile. You made it," William murmured, his voice still weak and hoarse. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. Margaret held his hand gently. "No, William, we made it. You fought, and we all fought alongside you." At that moment, the doctor entered the room with a satisfied smile. "Mr. William," he said, examining the equipment around the bed. "The surgery was a success. Of course, the recovery will be a slow process, but the worst is over." Emily exchanged glances with Margaret and couldn't hide her smile. "I knew you would overcome this," she said, leaning toward William. "Now, just follow the doctor's orders, and soon you'll be back to your life." William, though feeling deep gratitude, was still in shock. The fact that he had survived, that he was there, in that hospital room, breathing without pain, it seemed like a miracle. For so many months, he had only survived, one day at a time, with no perspective beyond his own misery. But now there was something more. In the days that followed, William began the slow and arduous process of recovery. He started with small walks down the hospital corridor, always supported by Margaret, who continued to visit him regularly. She was tireless, taking care of every detail of his recovery. Her experience as a retired nurse was a true gift, and William felt that, for the first time in a long while, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. "You are a blessing, Margaret," William said one afternoon as she helped him adjust the pillows on the bed. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She smiled, but there was humility in her eyes. "I just did what anyone would do. Besides, taking care of you gave me purpose again. I lost my husband years ago, and since then, it's the first time I feel like I'm truly helping someone live." William, moved by her words, held her hand for a moment. "You gave me more than help. You brought hope back into my life." Meanwhile, Emily, who also visited him whenever she could, was restless. She couldn't shake the mystery surrounding the benefactor who had funded William's surgery. During her visits, she asked the doctors and hospital staff a few discreet questions, but no one seemed to know where the money had come from. Every lead turned out to be a dead end. "It's hard to believe that someone, out of nowhere, would pay for such an expensive surgery," Emily said to Margaret one night as they met in the hospital corridor. "But at the same time, I feel like William must have touched someone's life in a way he didn't even realize." Margaret agreed, but kept her focus on the present. "Whoever did this gave him a new chance, and that's what we need to concentrate on now. The rest, well, maybe William will discover it in time." As the days passed, William slowly regained his strength. He could now walk longer, and his breathing became more natural, without the pain that had suffocated him for so long. But along with his physical recovery came the realization that he couldn't return to the small apartment where he had spent the last years in solitude. The place simply didn't have the necessary conditions to ensure his full recovery. "I can't go back to that place," William remarked one afternoon, a note of concern in his voice. "The apartment is too small, damp, and with no one to help me, I'm afraid I'll end up back at the same point." Margaret, always a step ahead, smiled upon hearing his words. "William," she began, with a calm but determined voice, "I've been thinking about it. I've been living alone since my husband passed away. The house is spacious, has plenty of room, and I would be happy if you accepted to stay there during your recovery. I can continue taking care of you until you're strong enough to decide what to do next." William remained silent, surprised. He had never thought about depending on someone so directly, but he knew Margaret was being sincere. I can't ask that of you, Margaret. You've already done so much for me." "You're not asking, William," she replied softly. "I'm offering. And honestly, having your company would be good for me too. The house has been very empty. So, please, consider it." He looked at her, still doubtful. He wasn't used to relying on others, but he knew that without help, he couldn't maintain the progress he had made. "If you're sure," he said finally, his heart full of gratitude, "I accept, and I promise I'll do my best not to be a burden." Margaret laughed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "William, you've never been a burden. It will be a pleasure to have you around." With this new perspective, William felt an inner peace he hadn't felt in many years. He still didn't know who his anonymous benefactor was, but for the first time, it didn't matter as much. What mattered was that he was alive, surrounded by people who truly cared about him. The morning was sunny on the day William left the hospital. He felt like a transformed man, not only because of the successful surgery, but also because of the constant support he had received. The ambulance dropped him off at Margaret's house, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. Margaret guided him to the door, opening it with a welcoming smile. "Welcome to your new home, William," she said as she helped him enter. William looked around, absorbing the environment. It was a simple house, but full of life. Small flower pots decorated the living room, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen. He took a deep breath, feeling the clean, fresh air fill his lungs. After so long in the dark, lonely apartment, this house felt like a true refuge. "I don't know how I can thank you for all this, Margaret," he said, his voice still a bit weak. "You've already done so much for me." Margaret shook her head, a warm smile on her lips. "You don't need to thank me, William. I'm happy to help. Just take care of yourself, okay?" In the first days, William still struggled with the discomfort of depending so much on another person. He, who had spent so many years surviving alone without leaning on anyone, felt vulnerable accepting so much help. At the same time, Margaret's kindness made him realize that accepting help wasn't always a sign of weakness. It was sometimes just part of the healing process. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood with slow steps, William was surprised to hear a familiar voice. "William, William, is that you?" He turned and saw a man with grey hair, an old acquaintance from his days as a newspaper seller. The man watched him with wide eyes, as if seeing a ghost. "Charlie?" William asked, the surprise evident on his face. "I can't believe it," Charlie said, approaching quickly. "I thought I'd never see you again. You disappeared. William, what happened?" William took a deep breath, thinking about how to explain what he had been through. I got sick, Charlie. Very sick. But someone helped me, and now I'm trying to recover." Charlie shook his head, impressed. "It's good to see you back, my friend. People always asked about you on the corner. You were part of the city's landscape. William smiled, touched to know that, even though he had been invisible for so long, there were still people who remembered him fondly. It's good to be back. I'm trying to start over, one step at a time. Upon returning home after the brief conversation, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a true sense of belonging. People remembered him. He wasn't just a lost face in the crowd, after all. In the days that followed, William and Margaret began to build a deep friendship. In the evenings, they sat on Margaret's porch, talking for hours. William found himself reliving memories he had buried during years of loneliness. He shared with Margaret about his youth, how he had dreams of traveling the country and seeing the world. He talked about the times he sold newspapers, when the streets were his stage, and how life had somehow swallowed him up over the years. Sometimes, I wonder how everything changed so quickly, William said one of those afternoons, watching the sun set. I had so many dreams when I was young. Now, all I have are the memories. Margaret listened attentively, her expression calm. Life has a strange way of taking us down paths we never expected. William, I had my own plans too, but things changed. I lost my husband early on, and for a while, I felt completely lost. Only after a long time did I realize that there was strength in helping others. That's how I started to feel alive again. William looked at her, feeling deep gratitude. You gave me a new chance to live, Margaret. I never thought someone could care so much. She smiled, squeezing his hand lightly. You gave me a new chance too, William. It's never too late to start over. Despite these moments of tranquility, William's curiosity about the mysterious benefactor who had funded his surgery began to grow. He couldn't stop wondering who had done something so grand for him, a man who had no one. No matter how much he tried to focus on his recovery, the mystery persisted in his mind. Do you think it was someone from my past? William asked one night as they were in the living room. Or maybe someone I helped without even realizing it? Margaret pondered this for a moment. It's possible, William, but whoever it was, they wanted to give you a new chance. Maybe one day you'll find out who it is, maybe not. But what's important now is that you continue to recover. William nodded, trying to accept what Margaret was saying. But deep down, he knew that at some point he would have to uncover the truth. As the weeks passed, William began to feel stronger, both physically and emotionally. He still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that life could still offer him something good. Margaret's constant presence and Emily's unwavering support had helped him see the world with new eyes. What was once just survival now seemed like the beginning of something new, something he never imagined was possible. After weeks of careful recovery at Margaret's welcoming home, William felt it was time to return to his own apartment. Although he wasn't fully recovered yet, his body was getting stronger each day, and he wanted, more than ever, to resume life where he had left it. Margaret, always careful and attentive, helped him with every step of the move, ensuring he had everything he needed to continue recovering comfortably in his home. I'll be around, William, Margaret said as she helped him settle into the small apartment. I'll drop by regularly to see how you're doing. If you need anything at all, just call me. William smiled at her, grateful. Thank you, Margaret. You've done so much for me. I don't know how I'll ever thank you. She shook her head, a warm smile on her lips. You don't need to thank me, William. I'm happy to help. Just take care of yourself, okay? As soon as Margaret left, leaving him in peace in his familiar apartment, William felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The place, modest and small, was his home, but it felt different now. Without Margaret's constant and warm presence, the silence felt heavier, the emptiness more pronounced. Still, he felt grateful to be back, to have a space of his own. But there was something undeniably different, something he hadn't felt since he fell ill. He knew he was in the process of healing, and that brought an unexpected sense of tranquility. As the days passed, Margaret kept her promise. She visited him regularly, always bringing something to eat, a homemade soup, freshly baked bread, or small gifts she said she had found by chance. The visits were a relief for William, both for the practical care and the companionship. They talked about light things, without delving too much into the surgery or William's recent struggles. Margaret knew how to respect his emotional space, always offering the necessary support without pressuring him to revisit recent traumas. On the other hand, William knew that his old life as a newspaper seller was definitely behind him. His body, though more stable, could no longer handle the long hours on the streets, facing the cold and heat, trying to sell newspapers for some change. He accepted this reality without sadness. Instead, he began to reflect on what he could do next. Between Margaret's visits and moments of rest, William started to think about his skills. He had spent most of his life interacting with people, listening to their stories, understanding their desires and frustrations while selling newspapers. Perhaps, he thought, that experience could be applied in a new way. But he wasn't ready to look for a new job yet. Physical recovery came first, but in his mind, he began to envision a new possible life, a life that didn't involve so much physical effort but still allowed him to interact with people the way he always enjoyed. In those quiet afternoons, as the soft sunlight streamed through the window, William found comfort in the small things. The distant sound of the city reminded him that life was continuing outside, and Margaret's constant visits were a point of stability in his life. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to live one day at a time. His focus was now on recovery, both physical and emotional. There was a future for him, and that was all that mattered at the moment. It was a calm afternoon, and William was sitting in his favorite chair, watching the soft sunlight stream through his small apartment window. The silence was somewhat comforting, but at the same time, a constant reminder of his solitude. He had gotten used to it, the routine of quiet days interspersed with Margaret's visits. His recovery was progressing, but there was still a long road ahead. Suddenly, an unexpected knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. William slowly got up, feeling his body still a bit weak, and walked to the door. He imagined it might be Margaret or perhaps one of the neighbors. When he opened it, however, he was surprised by a woman he had never seen before. She was well dressed, with a confident posture, but her gaze was gentle. "Good afternoon," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Jane. I'm a private detective. I'm here at the request of someone who has been looking for you for some time." William frowned, confused and a bit alarmed. "Looking for me?" He hesitated for a moment, but eventually invited Jane inside. "Come in, please." Jane accepted the invitation and entered the modest apartment, sitting in the chair William offered her. He watched her, intrigued. Who would be trying to find me? I can't imagine anyone from my past who would do that. She gave a slight smile, trying to calm him. It's someone you helped many years ago, a man who was in a very critical moment in his life, and you, with a simple gesture of kindness, changed everything for him. William looked at her with even more confusion. Someone I helped? He shook his head, trying to remember someone, but his mind couldn't associate any face or name with what Jane was saying. Jane then took a deep breath and continued. "Years ago, you gave your last $5 to a street boy. He was hungry and hopeless, but instead of using the money to eat, he bought flowers and started selling them on the streets. Over time, he expanded. He began selling chocolates and eventually set up small gift baskets. That small business grew, and now he owns a successful chain of gift shops in the city." William remained silent, shocked by the revelation. He had almost forgotten that small act of kindness, something that, to him, seemed insignificant. He had never imagined it would have such a profound impact. I didn't know. It was just a small help. The young man smiled. You gave me a chance when no one else saw me. I wanted to give you a new chance too. Now that I'm stable, I have a good life. I want to repay what you did for me. They continued talking for hours, sharing stories, memories, and mutual gratitude. The once quiet apartment was now filled with life, laughter, and tears of emotion. William, who had spent so much time in solitude, now found himself connected to someone he had helped transform his life, and that connection filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. The day after the emotional reunion, William woke up with a sense of expectation he hadn't felt in a long time. There was something different about that day, something that made him get out of bed with a renewed purpose. He tidied the small apartment, preparing for the arrival of Ethan, the man he had helped so many years ago. Although he was still stunned by the recent events, William felt that something big was about to happen. And, as expected, the familiar knock sounded at the door. When William opened it, there stood Ethan, the 30-year-old man, with the same warm smile from the previous day. "Good morning, William," Ethan said, entering with the confidence of a close friend. "I've been thinking a lot since our conversation yesterday." William nodded, still a bit skeptical about what else could be coming. "Me too," he replied, as they sat down in the living room. "I could barely sleep thinking about all this." Ethan smiled, understanding William's confusion. "I can imagine. But I don't want you to worry. I want to continue what we started yesterday, and that includes a concrete proposal." William frowned, feeling his curiosity grow. "Proposal? What do you have in mind?" Ethan adjusted himself in the chair, looking directly into William's eyes with gentle seriousness. "You gave me an opportunity when no one else did. You helped a boy who was at the bottom of the pit, and thanks to that, my life changed completely. Now, I want to do the same for you. I want you to work with me, William. I know you can't go back to selling newspapers, but that doesn't mean you have nothing left to offer." William was silent for a moment, processing Ethan's words. He had never thought about returning to work, especially after everything he had been through. But what would I do? I'm old now, Ethan. I don't have the same strength as before. Ethan smiled reassuringly. "I'm not asking you to return to physical labor, William. What I want is your experience, your way with people. You spent years on the streets, selling newspapers and dealing with all kinds of people. That's something you can't learn anywhere else. I want you to come work at one of my stores, overseeing the team, interacting with customers, bringing the human touch you've always had." William blinked, astonished. "You really think I can do that?" "Absolutely," Ethan replied without hesitation. "You've already done something much harder when you saved my life with just $5. Now, it's my turn to ensure you have the dignified life you deserve." William's heart raced, emotions swirling between gratitude and disbelief. He had never imagined he would receive such a generous second chance. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan smiled again, extending his hand to shake William's. "You don't need to thank me. I just want you to accept my help in the same way you accepted helping me so many years ago." After a few moments of reflection, William nodded. "I accept," he said, his eyes welling with tears, "and I will be eternally grateful for this." But Ethan wasn't finished yet. "Besides the job, I also want to make you another offer. I know you have your own home here, but I live in a big house with my wife and children. We have extra bedrooms. You don't need to live alone in this small, silent apartment. If you want, you can come live with us. You'll have your own privacy, of course, but you'll also have a family that cares about you." William felt tears threatening to fall as he absorbed Ethan's generosity. He had spent so much time getting used to loneliness that, for a moment, he didn't know how to react to the idea of being part of a family again. I don't know if I deserve this." Ethan shook his head firmly. "You deserve more than that, William. You deserve to have a good, dignified life. And more importantly, you deserve to be surrounded by people who care about you." William swallowed hard, gratitude and emotion overflowing in his chest. "So, yes," he finally responded. "Yes, I accept." Ethan smiled and stood up, extending his hand to William. "Welcome to our family, William." In the following days, William began packing his few belongings. The small apartment that had been his home for so many years now seemed like a distant memory of another life. Margaret helped him with the move, as always careful and helpful, but happy to see William taking a big step toward a new life. When he arrived at Ethan's house, William was impressed by its size and warmth. It was a simple house, but large and full of life. Ethan's wife, Lily, greeted him with a warm smile, and their two energetic children ran up to greet him. William was welcomed as a family member from the very first moment. As he walked down the hallway to the room that would be his, William felt a deep sense of peace. He had never imagined that his life could change so drastically, so unexpectedly, and yet here he was, surrounded by people who loved and respected him, with a new perspective on life. Sitting on the bed, William looked out the window and saw the sunset bathing the backyard in a soft golden light. He knew his journey was still not complete. There was still much to learn and experience, but for the first time in many years, he felt at home. A second chance at life, and now, he knew he would never be alone again. This story teaches us something powerful about the impact our actions can have on people's lives, often in ways we could never foresee. When William gave his last $5 to that hungry boy, he had no way of knowing that that simple gesture would change the boy's life forever. This is the first lesson we can apply in our own lives. Never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. It may seem insignificant to you, but for someone facing difficulties, it can be the difference between hope and despair. In our daily lives, we can practice this lesson by being more aware of the needs of those around us. A practical exercise would be to try to help someone at least once a week, whether by offering your time, a kind word, or even a simple gesture like buying someone a coffee. Observe how these small actions can create a positive impact. Another important lesson from this story is about the importance of accepting help. William was always a proud and independent man, accustomed to handling his problems alone. However, he had to face the truth that, at times, accepting help from others is not only necessary, but also a way to allow them to express love and care. In our daily lives, we might feel uncomfortable asking for or accepting help, but it's important to remember that accepting support is not a sign of weakness, but rather of humanity. A practical way to apply this is to make a list of the things you struggle with the most, and try to identify someone in your life who can offer support. Allow yourself to ask for help in one of these areas, and observe how it can strengthen your connections with others. Finally, the story reminds us of the value of gratitude and reciprocity. When Ethan returned to William's life, he was determined to repay what William had done for him, not because he felt he needed to pay a debt, but because he understood the value of what he received and wanted to spread that kindness. This shows us that when we are grateful and acknowledge what has been given to us, we create a chain of kindness that continues to flow. In our daily lives, we can practice this lesson by dedicating a moment each night to reflect on something or someone we are grateful for. And as an exercise, try to do something for someone who has helped you in the past. It could be a thank you message or a reciprocal gesture. This creates a positive cycle that not only benefits you but also those around you. These lessons teach us to be more human, compassionate, and connected with the people in our lives, showing that often, the greatest impacts come from actions and attitudes that, at first glance, may seem small and insignificant.